The little girl stood in the middle of the crowded charity ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet somehow she looked completely alone. At 8 years old, Mireya Vale had already learned the cruelest lesson a child could learn: sometimes people could see you perfectly and still choose not to notice you. She watched mouths move, watched people laugh, watched children run toward their parents, but the world around her remained silent. Then, across the enormous room, a tired single father looked up from the table where he was helping his young son with a plate of fruit, noticed the little girl standing by herself, and did something nobody else had thought to do. He lifted one hand, moved his fingers carefully, and signed one simple word: "Hello." Mireya froze. For the first time that afternoon, her eyes widened with something that looked almost like hope. Before we continue, if you believe kindness and second chances can change someone's life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel, Hardworking Dad. Your support helps us bring more stories about courage, family, and the small acts of kindness that can change everything. Mireya was the only daughter of Cassian Vale, one of the most powerful technology CEOs in the city. His name appeared on magazine covers, business websites, and giant screens at financial conferences. He owned a glass-walled headquarters downtown, drove through the city surrounded by security vehicles, and was known for making decisions that could move entire companies overnight. But none of that mattered to Mireya. She did not care about stock prices or expensive cars. She cared about being understood. She had been born deaf, and although she had learned American Sign Language with the help of specialists, her father had never truly learned how to communicate with her. Cassian loved his daughter deeply, but love did not automatically teach a person how to cross a bridge they had never learned to build. His schedule was filled with meetings, flights, negotiations, and emergencies. He hired the best tutors and therapists money could buy, believing that providing everything was the same as being present. Mireya slowly learned to stop asking him to sit beside her. That afternoon, Cassian had brought Mireya to a foundation fundraiser because the event was connected to one of his company's major charitable partnerships. He had promised himself he would spend the entire evening with her, but within 20 minutes, 3 executives had surrounded him with urgent questions. Mireya stood nearby, waiting. Then she drifted toward the children's area, where several wealthy families had gathered. She tried to join a group of girls decorating small paper crowns. One girl stared at her hands when Mireya began signing. Another child whispered something to her mother. The mother gently pulled her daughter away. Nobody was openly cruel, but the rejection was somehow worse because it was wrapped in polite smiles and awkward avoidance. Mireya lowered her hands and stepped away. That was when she noticed Rowan Mercer. Rowan was 38, broad-shouldered, quietly dressed in a navy shirt and dark trousers, with short brown hair beginning to show a few strands of gray near his temples. His face carried the tiredness of a man who had spent years learning to remain calm when everything around him was falling apart. He was at the fundraiser because his son, Kellen, had received a community scholarship from the foundation. Most people would never have guessed that Rowan had once served as a Navy SEAL. He had left the military years earlier after an operation that changed his life, choosing a quieter existence focused on raising Kellen and working as a security consultant. He rarely talked about his past. To him, the medals and missions belonged to another lifetime. What mattered now was getting his son ready for school, making sure the rent was paid, and being the father he had once promised himself he would become. Rowan noticed Mireya because he recognized the expression on her face. It was the expression of someone trying not to cry in public. He had seen it before, years earlier, in places where frightened people were surrounded by strangers who could not understand what they were going through. He watched her hands move uncertainly, then realized she was signing. Rowan knew only basic sign language, but he had learned enough during his years in the military to communicate with people from different backgrounds and to understand the importance of nonverbal communication. So he raised his hand and slowly signed hello. Mireya stared at him as though he had just performed a miracle. Then she smiled. It was small at first, almost hesitant. But it was real. Rowan signed that he was glad to meet her. Mireya responded quickly, her hands moving faster than he could follow. She seemed surprised that someone had answered her. Rowan smiled apologetically and admitted that his signing was rusty. Mireya laughed silently. It was the first genuine laugh she had shared that day. Across the ballroom, Cassian finally noticed his daughter smiling at a stranger. His expression immediately changed. Security moved toward Rowan, but Cassian raised his hand and stopped them. He watched carefully as Rowan continued trying to communicate with Mireya. There was something about the scene that unsettled him. Not because Rowan was dangerous, but because his daughter looked happier with this exhausted single father after 5 minutes than she had looked with Cassian in weeks. Cassian walked over and introduced himself. Rowan recognized the name instantly but showed no excitement. He simply nodded and looked back at Mireya. That small gesture stayed with Cassian. Most people treated him like a powerful man. Rowan treated him like a father standing beside his daughter. The evening might have ended there, but something unexpected happened. During the Foundation's closing presentation, the ballroom lights suddenly flickered. A technical failure caused one section of the ceiling equipment to malfunction, sending a loud burst of sparks from a lighting rig. People panicked. Guests rushed toward the exits. Children began crying. Security struggled to control the crowd. In the confusion, Mireya became separated from Cassian. She could not hear the alarms. She could not hear people shouting. She only saw people running. And then she disappeared into the crowd. Cassian's world collapsed. Security searched the ballroom, hallways, kitchens, and garden. Cassian ran through every doorway shouting her name, forgetting his reputation, his wealth, everything except the terrifying fact that his little girl was missing. Rowan immediately began searching too. His military instincts returned with frightening precision. He studied the movement of the crowd, noticed which doors had remained open, and realized that Mireya would not necessarily follow the sound of alarms like everyone else. She would follow familiar visual spaces. He remembered seeing her earlier near the garden. He ran outside. The garden was bright beneath the clear afternoon sky, with trimmed hedges, stone pathways, and large glass doors reflecting the frantic movement inside. Rowan scanned the area and noticed a small figure crouched behind a decorative wall near a fountain. Mireya. She was frightened, clutching her knees. Rowan approached slowly, keeping his hands visible. He did not grab her. He knelt several feet away and signed hello again. Mireya looked up. Then she ran into his arms. Rowan held her carefully while she cried against his shoulder. For several seconds, the former SEAL closed his eyes, remembering every person he had once been unable to save. But this time, he had found someone. Cassian arrived moments later. He dropped to his knees in front of his daughter, tears filling his eyes. Mireya looked between her father and Rowan. Then she reached for her father's hands and slowly began signing. Cassian didn't understand. That moment broke something inside him. For the first time, he saw the full distance between himself and his daughter. He had spent years paying experts to communicate with her while never learning to communicate with her himself. Rowan quietly told Cassian that Mireya needed more than protection. She needed participation. She needed someone willing to enter her world instead of constantly asking her to live inside everyone else's. Cassian looked at his daughter and realized how many times she had probably been trying to tell him exactly that. The next morning, something changed. For the first time in years, Cassian cancelled his meetings. He sat beside Mireya at the kitchen table while a sign language instructor taught him the basics. He struggled terribly. His hands moved too slowly. He forgot signs. Mireya corrected him again and again. But instead of becoming frustrated, Cassian laughed at himself and tried again. Rowan continued helping them, not because Cassian paid him, but because he understood that some things were worth doing simply because they were right. Weeks passed. Mireya began spending time with Kellen. The two children discovered their own friendship, one built around drawing, games, and a strange collection of homemade hand signals they invented together. Cassian started attending Mireya's school events. He learned to sign her name. He learned how to ask if she was okay. He learned how to say good morning, thank you, and most importantly, I love you. One afternoon, months after the fundraiser, Mireya stood on a small stage at a community center during a children's presentation. Cassian sat in the front row. Rowan and Kellen sat beside him. Mireya looked out at the audience. Then she lifted her hands. She signed a short message about kindness, friendship, and how sometimes the person who notices you can change your entire world. Cassian cried openly. Rowan looked down, trying to hide his own tears. When Mireya finished, the audience rose in applause. She could not hear it. But she could see it. And that was enough. Later, Cassian approached Rowan outside beneath the bright afternoon sky. He thanked him, but Rowan simply told him that he had not done anything extraordinary. He had only noticed a child who needed someone to notice her. Cassian shook his head. He finally understood that extraordinary things often begin exactly that way. Not with money. Not with power. Not with grand speeches. Just with one person choosing to stop, look, and say hello. Years later, Mireya would remember that day as the moment her world changed. She would become an advocate for children with hearing differences, helping schools create better communication programs and encouraging families to learn sign language together. Rowan remained a quiet presence in her life, and Kellen became one of her closest friends. Cassian never stopped learning. He eventually transformed part of his foundation into a program that provided sign language education to families who could not afford it. And whenever someone asked Cassian what inspired the change, he never talked about the billions his company was worth. He talked about his daughter. He talked about the day he realized that being a father wasn't simply about protecting a child from the world. Sometimes, it meant learning how to enter the child's world. So if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your engagement may help this message reach another person who needs it today. And before we end, here's a special request: comment the word "hello" below if you believe everyone deserves to be seen, heard, understood, and treated with kindness. Because sometimes, the smallest gesture can become the beginning of an entirely new life. A little girl had been surrounded by hundreds of people who ignored her. One tired father noticed. He lifted his hand. And he signed one simple word. Hello. That was all it took to remind her that she was never invisible.